Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome Kathleen Marden and Pamela Nance. Kathleen is a respected investigator of UFO abduction and contact with non-human intelligence, the author of several books, a featured on-camera commentator, and an international lecturer. She is a practitioner of regression hypnosis and the quantum healing hypnosis technique. Her interest in UFOs and contact began in 1961 when her aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill, had a close encounter and subsequent abduction in New Hampshire's White Mountains. She has been a researcher of UFO contact phenomena since 1990 and is the Mutual UFO Network's Experiencer Research Team's director since 2011. And she is an advisory board member and consultant to the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters. She is also a contributor to Freeze Beyond UFOs, the Science of Consciousness and Contact with Non-Human Intelligence, and her essays have been published in several additional books and magazines. Pamela Nance is an archaeologist and anthropologist by degree, with minor degrees in religion and sociology, and is a recent retiree from Wake Forest University School of Medicine following a 30-year career in the field of biostatistical sciences and clinical trial research. She is also a seasoned investigator into the survival of consciousness after death, a trained healing touch practitioner, past life regressionist, and hypnotherapist. She has had a keen interest in the paranormal after experiencing unexplained ET and spirit phenomena throughout her life, and an out-of-body experience as a teen and a near-death experience in her early 30s. She formalized her interest in the field 12 years ago when she began investigating historic sites as a paranormal investigator. Kathleen and Pam, welcome. How are y'all tonight?
Thank you. Very well.
Very good. I've been looking forward to tonight. We're going to discuss a little bit about one of the most famous abduction cases, Kathleen's aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill. We're also going to be discussing some of Pam's own experiences and both of your insights and the investigation at Chris Bledsoe's house. We're going to get both of your insights into that, the phenomenon in general, and I'd like to go as deep as possibly can. First, let's start by talking about what brought you two together and got you started working together.
I was introduced to Pam and Ashley, her co-investigator, by Stanton Friedman. And the reason that he introduced us is because he was impressed by their scientific rigor, and he thought that I should connect with them and show an interest in their work, and so that's exactly what we did.
Anything to add to that, Pam?
That pretty much sums it up. Stanton was instrumental in bringing Kathleen and I together, and so I'll be forever grateful to him for that.
Now, before we start to get into any of the experiences with Betty and Barney Hill and then Chris Bledsoe's house, I'd like to start with when did you, Pam, start having your first paranormal or contact experiences?
Well, I pretty much have experienced paranormal activity my entire life. I had unexplained phenomena happening to me as a child. Beginning around the age of 5, with the ability, it seemed at the time, to be able to leave my body and zoom around the countryside. And I thought everyone could do that. And I shared, that information with my family and was told that that was not something I should talk about, that, it's not normal. And so I kind of kept it to myself and would practice when alone, and I did that for maybe about 3 or 4 years. But also I had encounters with beings in my room at night, and all of this was very frightening, as a young child, not knowing if they were friends or foe. Of course, my young mind went straight to ghosts and scary things, not really understanding what was happening to me. Although my mother was very open-minded and a bit of a psychic, as well as my grandmother and 2 great aunts, they were midwives and root doctors and healers. And so I was raised in an atmosphere of being open-minded to spirit, but it wasn't something that you really talked about outside the home. Those were private conversations. But so I always felt like I was the odd kid on the outside looking in at everyone. And my experiences were very different from most children. And then at the age of 16, when I underwent a tonsillectomy, I had an out-of-body experience. And it was very real. I was in the recovery room. I left my body. I saw myself lying on the gurney. And then in my early 30s, I had a near-death experience after a stomach bleed. And so from early childhood through young adulthood, numerous experiences. And so that kind of shaped my mind to be very open-minded to other things, that what we see is not always reality. And so in 2008, I formalized that interest with Ashley Field, my co-partner in the paranormal team. And so we began our sort of ghost hunting career at that point.
Very good. Now, Kathleen, of course, I can see how one of the most famous UFO cases in history would get you interested in ufology. But before that, were you interested in UFOs? And when did you first hear about your aunt and uncle's case?
Well, I was 13 when my aunt and uncle had their experience, and there was really no interest in UFOs. Prior to that, I didn't even know that such an object existed. So it came as a complete shock to me when Betty and Barney returned home from a short vacation they had taken to upstate New York and Canada, and had this close encounter and missing time event on their return trip. Betty called my mother, who was her younger sister, when she arrived home. And after, later in the day, actually, they arrived at about 5 o'clock in the morning. They ended up taking a nap, and then Betty called my mother in the afternoon, and I had arrived home from school, so I overheard the conversation.
Now, for those of my audience that haven't heard about this case, which I'm pretty much sure that most of my audience has, could you give like a brief overview of what happened to your aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill?
Sure. They were driving through upstate New Hampshire. It was about 11 o'clock at night when they spotted a strange object in the sky, and it came in closer and closer. Finally, it descended to within 100 feet of their vehicle. Barney had to stop the car in the middle of the road. He opened the door, he stepped out. He was looking up at this craft through his binoculars. Betty was looking through the window. She was seated on the passenger side. And Barney stepped back, and when he did, the craft shifted to an adjacent field. It descended even lower. Barney knew that this was impossible. He kept shaking his head, saying, "It can't be, I have to identify this." And so he walked across the street toward this craft, and then he observed non-human entities looking down at him. In the first report that he and Betty sent to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena on September 26, 1961, only 6 days after this event, they stated that this craft had a very unusual flight pattern. It was erratic. It ascended vertically, descended vertically, shot around, seemed to bounce back and forth in the sky. Then that Barney had actually observed these entities looking down at him that appeared to be dressed in black shiny uniforms that frightened him greatly. He ran back to the car in a hysterical state, went speeding down the highway. This craft then changed position and was over the top of the vehicle. And then he and Betty heard a series of code-like buzzing sounds striking the trunk of the car. When this happened, the car vibrated and a tingling sensation passed through their bodies. The next thing they knew, and as if only a moment had passed, they found themselves about 30 miles down the highway. And they had a memory of observing a fiery orb that seemed to be sitting on the ground, of a roadblock somewhere along the way. They didn't know where or when that occurred. And they heard a second series of buzzing sounds. This time they didn't see the craft, but it seemed to have returned them to full consciousness. And they drove home, very perplexed by what happened. They found physical evidence and circumstantial evidence when they arrived home. Torn clothing. Barney's best dress shoes were so deeply scraped he had to buy new shoes. There were shiny spots on the trunk of the car that hadn't been there the day before, and there was a magnetic field around these spots. Betty's best dress was torn in several places. So many mysteries and increasing trauma as time went on for Barney. And finally, he was referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a renowned psychiatrist from Boston, Massachusetts. He and Betty underwent separate hypnosis sessions for a period of about 4 months, and then a couple of months beyond that of listening to the hypnosis tapes so they could see what the other one said. They had no knowledge of this prior to the later part of their therapy with Dr. Simon, because he had reinstated amnesia at the end of each session. Dr. Simon was renowned in his field because he had been able to help so many veterans who were returning after World War II with what they then called shell shock and conversion hysteria, the same kind of symptoms that Barney was exhibiting, and that's why he was referred to him. And what unfolded was a separate account by Betty and Barney that were nearly identical, of finding themselves on a lonely dirt road surrounded by tall trees, that fiery orb, that roadblock, and those entities coming to their doors, taking them from the car and onto a craft. Every piece of physical evidence has been explained, and there has been scientific analysis done as well. It's all in my book, Captured, The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience with Stanton T. Friedman. They were given physical examinations by what many people think of as a gray kind of entity. They were not your typical grays. Some of them were, but then there were taller grays who were about 5 to 5.5 feet tall, who seemed more like people in a way, that although they didn't look like us. That was Betty's and Barney's impression of them. So Dr. Simon helped them greatly, especially Barney, in overcoming his trauma. They were given physical examinations, released unharmed, and these entities were very reassuring that no harm would come to them. They only needed to do a few simple experiments and then they would be released.
Now, I want to get into just a couple of little details about the abduction itself. Now, you said that the beings were various types of gray-looking entities. Would you say that the smaller grays were kind of the typical kind of robotic-like hive mind drone type of grays as they described?
What I can tell you is that they were the ones who were in the road, who took them to the craft where Betty fought not to go on and tore her dress. They stood in the room that Barney was in as guards. One stood outside Betty's door as a guard. Dr. Simon never asked the question, nor did I during my investigation, if they seemed to be sentient beings or robotic in nature. They did make the decision that Betty could not keep a piece of evidence that she was holding. She had found what we think of as like a tablet today with symbols in it. And she wanted to take that as evidence of her experience. She was told by the one who was her escort and what she called the leader, who was the interpreter, who spoke telepathically to her on the craft. He told her she could have it. But when this crew saw that Betty had that, they took it from her. The leader said that the decision had been made that she should not remember this event, and therefore she could not have evidence of it. Physical evidence, that is. There was evidence, though. They made a few mistakes.
She then later remembered some of the information that they had given her on the craft. Isn't that right?
Yes, she did. As the result of a post-hypnotic suggestion by Dr. Simon, she was able to sketch a star map that she was shown when she said to this leader, I know that you're not from around here, where's your home court? And she has described it as almost like looking out a window into space, or almost like a holographic image. And these stars were various sizes and colors. She was made to understand that the two larger ones in the forefront, about the size of nickels, were trade routes. There were 5 solid lines connecting them, meaning that they moved back and forth between each star system often. There were also 2 lines going up to what was later identified in a scientific identification of these stars as our sun. So our sun was on our map. It was a very interesting map because the scientists who studied Betty's map and verified that it was accurate in terms of distance and where these stars should have been and the size, and stated that all of these stars on Betty's map were sun-like, although only 5% of the stars in that volume of space were sun-like stars. And all of the sun-like stars in that volume of space were on Betty's map. They said that it made sense, nearest star to nearest star. And if we were to hop from star to star, that would be the road that we would take. So there was a lot of evidence, but followed by a lot of controversy as well.
Now, speaking of controversy, it must have been extremely hard for them to come out and talk about this. First of all, because no one talked about UFO or contact experiences, and then they were an interracial couple.
Absolutely, and they had vowed never to release this to the public. They were willing to talk to UFO investigators, to scientists, to the family, to close friends, to military officers at their church. But there was a violation of confidentiality in 1965, October of 1965, that carried their story to the public. And only then did Betty and Barney speak to a large audience. It took place in early November of 1965. They spoke at the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire, to an overflow crowd, and were introduced by the public information officer from Pease Air Force Base.
Before we move on from your aunt and uncles, I just want to get your overall takeaway from their case of, your understanding of the phenomenon based on their experiences.
Well, I have a very broad understanding of this. I've been studying it for 30 years. I've interviewed probably a few thousand experiencers and done many investigations of cases as well. And I have continued to look for evidence in the Hill case that has been examined scientifically. In 2021, there will be a second edition of Captured, my book, and it will be updated with the new scientific evidence. So I'm very excited about this. I believe that there is more scientific evidence in support of this event than in any other event in history.
Very good. Now, Pam, I'd like to hear about some of your personal contact experiences and experiences with extraterrestrials. Could you take us back to the first time you had what you would definitely consider an ET contact experience?
I was 10 years old, and I was in my room going to sleep one night, and suddenly there were two beings, a man and a woman, standing over my bed, and they were both dressed in black. They had dark brown hair. The woman's hair was shoulder length with bangs straight across. The man's hair, was a little bit long. It was not a really short haircut. They were very attractive people. They just stood over me and told me that they were going to take me. And I was extremely frightened. I wasn't sure what was happening. But they explained that in a past life, I was responsible for the killing of a sacred white elephant. And I had to have my karma balanced, and they were there to assist me in balancing my karma with this event that happened most likely several thousand years ago. And so they floated me out of the room on board a craft and proceeded to do something with my head. I'm really not sure of all the details, but they were working around my head, and they floated me back into the room and departed. But when I don't know if I came to, or when I became aware that I was back in my room, I felt as though they had beheaded me. As a 10-year-old child, I was just extremely frightened. It probably was the most frightening experience I've ever had in my entire life. Relived it time and time again. I had PTSD for years after that happened to me. I couldn't figure out, what it meant as a 10-year-old, but I certainly did not know anything about any sacred white elephants. I was raised in the rural countryside of North Carolina in a Southern Baptist church. I had never been introduced to Hinduism, any other religion, of that nature. And it was as an adult that I conducted some research and began to kind of connect dots. And some of the research took me back to the Mahabharata and a family of 5 brothers who fought in that battle. And one was condemned for the beheading of a sacred white elephant. And that's what those people told me, that they were balancing my karma for the beheading of the sacred white elephant. So I don't know if, there's a true connection to that Indian person from the Mahabharata, but that was the closest I could come to finding any connection. So I really think something happened to me. I did not imagine that. And another striking piece of evidence occurred. I'm not sure if it was immediately or a few days later, but I woke up and I had a rash, like just a really bad rash from the neck up. It covered my entire head. And my parents took me to the doctor. The doctor could not figure out what had caused the rash. But now, upon reflection, perhaps it came from being exposed to something while on board the craft, maybe part of the procedure that they conducted, to balance my karma. I don't know if that affected my skin, but that's sort of a dot that I connected to that incident. But it was very, very frightening.
Very interesting. Now, moving on a little later in your life, could you tell us about some of your, your more recent experiences?
Sure. So I think it was 1967, my family and I, we were out on the front porch of our home out in the country, and it was probably about 5 or 6 in the evening. And this would have been around the same period of time the two beings came into my room. But my entire family were sitting out on the porch. It's a hot summer evening. And my little 5-year-old brother shouted, "Look," and he pointed across a field to the tops of some trees. And there was a silver disc. My entire family saw it sitting there. And, of course, we became very excited, not really frightened, but, excited about seeing this unusual object in the sky. And as soon as, we were all chattering about it, it just zipped off to the west. So it was sitting in the eastern part of the sky, and within a second, it was gone. Other things that happened, I would periodically wake up with nosebleeds in the middle of the night, profuse nosebleeds. And my mom and my sister would get up with me. And so that happened regularly as a small child, these unexplained nosebleeds. The doctor couldn't explain it. Another time I did not sleepwalk, but I was found outside in the yard, unconscious, and this was around the same time period. And my dad brought me back inside, put me on the bed. My mom was working a second shift job at the time, so he sent my older brother next door for this man who was a good friend of ours to come, help him, because he couldn't figure out what was happening to me. And I remember waking up, and my entire family and this neighbor, they were standing over me. And I remembered what happened, but I was so embarrassed because all of these people were staring at me. I would not tell them what had occurred. But what I remembered was being outside and seeing like a bright light shining down, almost like a searchlight. And I'm running and hiding behind trees, trying to get away from this light. And that was the last thing I remember until I guess my dad got up maybe to check on us kids, and I wasn't in the house, and that's when he found me outside. And then just lots of dreams of sort of the same thing, of being in the yard and running and hiding from lights, and seeing spaceships, like huge crafts in the sky with the lights coming down, and I'm running and I'm hiding, trying to get away, but they always seem to be able to find me. And I always thought those were dreams, and now I'm not so sure that they were dreams. And so as I became an adult, I would have these situations in the afternoon. I worked double shifts at a restaurant working my way through college. And so I would come home between the lunch and dinner shift and attempt to just take a nap. And when I would lie down, invariably, I would start to feel a presence in the room, and I would always think, oh no, here we go again. And these beings, I could see them from my periphery vision, but I was like paralyzed. You hear people talking about, you know, they feel or sense something in the room, but they can't move. And that's the way it was always for me. I could not move, but I know they were in the room and that they would take me, because I always had that feeling that, you know, here we go again. But I would not have any conscious recall about what actually happened when I returned. I would also leave my body and walk around outside. And I would think, you know, I've got to get up. I need to get up. And so I would be back in my body, and then I would be back outside. Or it was almost like astral travel, but I never went really too far out of my yard. So just lots of strangeness, you know, that I can't explain. And then in 1989, I was in the home that I'm in now, which I've been here for 39 years. It was about, I'd say about 7 or 8 in the evening. Again, it was in the summer, around the end of June. And my husband had just gotten home from work. And so he announced that he was going to hop in the shower. And so I decided to go out to check the mail. And I walked out the front porch and out onto the walkway, and immediately I could sense something over me. Just like immediate, I knew there was something above me. And I looked up. We have a 300-year-old oak tree in our front yard. It's about 500 feet tall. I mean, it's huge. It's massive. It's a treasured state tree. So I looked up, and above this oak tree was one of the huge black triangular crafts. It was just sitting there. It was not moving. There were no lights. You know, people often report a light on each corner, but I don't recall any lights, maybe because, you know, it was still daylight outside, but it was massive, massive craft. And I'm screaming for my husband, who is down off the front porch and through the bedroom taking a shower, just hoping, you know, that he could hear me and he could come witness what I was seeing. I'm not sure how long I stood there. It seemed like, you know, an eternity. And one second it's there, and the next it is gone. It left at such a high speed and zipped straight to the south. So of course I told my husband, and he was very disappointed that he didn't see what I had just seen. But I tuned into the local news that night at 11, and there were reports of a UFO in Salisbury. And Salisbury would be directly south from here, and that's the direction the craft flew in. There were no reports locally of any craft being seen, and so I was really disappointed about that. But about a year later, I was had started graduate school, and I was meeting with the head of the anthropology department in one of those meet and greet type get to know each other. And he saw my address, and he said, wow, I used to live on the same street that you live on. He said, we just moved away maybe in the last couple of years. But I said, oh yeah, you have the cute little redhead kid. He told me he lived in the house on the corner. And he said, you know, I have to share something with you. He said, my son saw a UFO when we lived on that circle. And I was like, really? And so he described what his son had seen. And I knew then that I had a witness. And it was actually the next evening after that event, I went outside and there were two little boys walking up the circle looking skyward. And so I went out, asked them, what are you looking for? And they said, we want to see the UFO that we saw last night. So I had, you know, some verification the next night. And then, you know, a year or two later in graduate school, the child's father is also validating what I had seen. And this was the head of the anthropology department at the university. And he believed his child. And I know what I saw. And it was incredible. It was absolutely incredible. So that experience, and, you know, just lots of paranormal activity in my home, and in my home as a child that I always chalked up to ghosts or, you know, dead people. But once, you know, I started broadening my viewpoint and doing research, I'm, you know, now sort of reevaluating that as ghostly activity, that perhaps some of it, if not the majority, was ET related.
Now, this question is for both of you. I guess we could start with Kathleen. What got you involved with the experiment to contact ETs?
Well, after I had been introduced to Pam and Ashley, they contacted me and they told me that they were interested in using their paranormal equipment and camera equipment too, in order to attempt to communicate or to at least capture EVPs of non-human entities on board these craft. And so the first thing I did was invited them down to Florida from North Carolina and Georgia. And I met them at the home of Denise Stoner. Now, she is an experiencer, and she's also a top-notch investigator. She's the assistant director of the Mutual UFO Network in the state of Florida, and she is my assistant on the experiencer research team for MUFON nationally and internationally. We wrote the book, The Alien Abduction Files, together. Now, so they went to Denise's home. We all met there for the afternoon, and they recorded these EVPs, and then we went over them. But they wanted to go to another experiencer's home, and since Chris Bledsoe lives in North Carolina as well, and I had spoken to him several times about his events, and I knew that they had been verified, then I asked Chris if it was okay to have Pam and Ashley contact him in order to do this experiment at this house. So the time frame was at Denise's house on June 20th, 2015, and a week later at Chris Bledsoe's house. So that's how it began.
Now, Pam, what led you to shift away from the paranormal and focus on the ET experience? And you know, how did you find out about the activity at Chris Bledsoe's?
So when Ashley and I began our formalized paranormal investigating in 2008, we entered that, you know, like most ghost hunters, you know, looking for ghost and spirit activity at reputed haunted locations. So we did a little bit of that around this area that I live in, and decided to just broaden it out a little bit with my background in anthropology and archaeology and Ashley's love of history. We decided to formalize a little more and target properties that had true historic value. So we sought out historic homes that didn't necessarily have to have any kind of paranormal activity going on. We had pretty much determined at that time any place, on Earth has potential activity. So we weren't really seeking out haunted locations. We were really seeking out historic locations. And so we would enter these locations having researched everything that we could possibly find out about the occupants and the land. And Ashley is a really good researcher into deeds and real estate. And so she would take a piece of property all the way back to the very first land grant, many times back into the 1600s. And so we would go into a location knowing all the information that was available to us in the public domain about each site. And we knew the family members' names, we knew their activities, and that seemed to really resonate with the spirits. We would get just numerous or dozens of Class A EVPs from these sites. It was really astounding how much they wanted to talk to us. I think they wanted to talk about themselves. And so we approached it in that sort of archaeological digging. We handled it almost like an archaeological site, looking at each layer of occupation. And having, getting so much great information from these folks, we started asking questions sort of off the cuff, like, where are you? Why can you communicate with us? Why we have to have all of this equipment to communicate with you, but you just readily, communicate with us. And so we began receiving responses like when we would ask, where are you? Or how do you get here? We would get portal and wormhole, and the spirits asking us, are you human? And we would ask them, what do we look like to you? And they would tell us dead, that we look dead to them or not human. And so it just made us start thinking outside the box of just ghostly activity. We're dealing with something other than trapped dead people. So at that point, we began exploring quantum theory. The multiverse, the string theory, sort of concepts that provide these layerings of dimensions where this energy could potentially be coming from. And so that kind of put us on to a whole new avenue of investigating. And I guess it was 2013 we presented at DragonCon in Atlanta, and we used some of our historical data, some of our really good Class A EVPs that were clearly coming from the historical layer, but we would also incorporate some of the what we gathered to be the ET communications coming through. So we combined that into our paranormal presentation, and that was the presentation that Stanton Friedman sat in on. And he was so taken with the quantum theory approach that we weren't actually dealing with trapped dead people or ghosts or residual hauntings or anything like that. That, you know, there was some validity to this other type of communication coming through. And so subsequently, he introduced us to Kathleen, and we ended up at Chris's place. It just seemed like a great fit for us.
Now, Kathleen, for those that aren't familiar with this, could you give us an overview on Chris Bledsoe's story and what the phenomenon that was occurring surrounding him?
Yes, Chris Bledsoe was a prominent businessman, building contractor in the town that he lived in, near Fayetteville, North Carolina. And he and some of his subcontractors were out on the river fishing one night when Chris went for a walk and just disappeared. And his son went for the walk and disappeared. And Chris was suffering from Crohn's disease at the time. He had become disabled because of it. He'd been in the hospital. And when he was found, when he was returned, he had been healed. The Mutual UFO Network began the investigation of this. He passed a lie detector test. There was a very thorough investigation. The investigators believed that this was indeed a real abduction event, and it became ongoing. Also, an investigator on his case is Colonel John Alexander, retired Army Colonel, also Dr. John Alexander. And he speaks publicly about this case. He believes that he has enough evidence to state that this is a real case. And it's extraordinarily interesting because not only is there UFO kind of alien activity, extraterrestrial type of activity, but there is also what appears to be, to Chris, angelic activity, where these very kind entities appear. And one is a woman, blonde woman dressed in a long flowing gown with outstretched arms, who is just very kind. He also, on the property he was living on at that time, had a tree that just started smoking. And what he discovered is that if he placed the possessions of people who were terribly ill in that tree, that they would be healed. So there was, all sorts of phenomena going on there. UFO, healing, maybe in the angelic realm, something highly positive. So it's very, very interesting to me and to other researchers too.
Definitely. Now, on that note, we're going to take a little break, just a few minutes here, and we'll come right back. Before we go on the break, we're going to be showcasing some more independent music for Forbidden Knowledge News Music. Today, we are going to feature music from Monatomic Music. They produce all their songs in 432 hertz. This song is Never Coming Down by Divine Love Mission. And we will be right back, everyone. You're listening on YouTube Live and the Global Enlightenment Radio Network. Pam and Nance, stand by. I'm going to just stop your video and audio for just a minute. And stand by, everyone. We'll be right back.
wave after wave after wave, on an ocean of love. I could drown in this sea, I could never get enough of this love, love of love. I don't know what you did to me, but I'm high up in the clouds. I have never felt like this before, and I'm never coming down. I don't know what you did to me, but there's something here profound. My mind's higher than it's been before, and I'm never coming down. Never coming down. Never coming You pray for it and you wait for it. You say you give up anything at all, just to have something to believe. Now I'm waking to a fairy tale. I'm in a world of make-believe. Just a kiss to seal my fate. It's all I don't know what you did to me, but I'm high up in the clouds. I have never felt like this before, and I'm never coming down. I don't know what you did to me, but there's something here profound. My mind's higher than it's been before, and I'm never coming down. Never coming down. Never coming
All right, we are back. You're listening on the Global Enlightenment Radio Network and YouTube Live. We are back here with Kathleen, Marden, and Pam Nance, and we're about to discuss more about the Chris Bledsoe investigation. And guys, if you would like your music featured here every Sunday on our breaks, just email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com, and we'll get that in there. So back to you, Kathleen. Tell us about the investigation itself. How did it get started, and what happened?
Well, Pam told me about a missing time event at Chris's house back in 2015, shortly after it happened. But she was experiencing trauma at that time, couldn't remember what happened on the craft, only knew there was missing time, had read, or knew about the things that the horror stories people talk about. But so I didn't do an investigation immediately because I won't do that when it might traumatize somebody even greater. I waited for her to be ready. And she reported this event to the Mutual UFO Network in 2018. They did a very thorough on-site investigation in North Carolina. and their final evaluation was that this was a CE4 event of an unknown. Then I began my ERT, Experiencer Research Team investigation. And my case disposition was substantial evidence case. So that was very important. I began by interviewing Pam extensively, Ashley extensively, collecting whatever evidence they had collected, because that is when I discovered the extent of this evidence, that not only did they have EVPs, but they also had captured non-human entities on Ashley's video camera. And so I'm still working on a frame-by-frame analysis of that, as is Ashley as well. So it was a very, very interesting case. And what really sets it apart from others is that not only were they credible, well-educated individuals, but there was substantial evidence. There were 3 people involved. They had missing time, and Chris's wife was looking for them during that time frame and could not find them. They had memories of being in the yard. They are very, very careful about the scientific protocols that they follow. They had followed all of these. The equipment is set up. They're holding equipment in their hands. Chris sees what he believes might be a craft up near the moon. He's pointing to it. It appears to be coming in their direction. The next thing they know, they're weaving back and forth. They're feeling nauseated, and their equipment is no longer in their hands. They look, and it's on the wet ground behind them. They would never have placed equipment there. And then they picked it up. They went into Chris's home, and that's when his wife said, "Where have you been? You've been gone." They realized that they had missing time of about 1 3/4 hours. I am also a quantum healing hypnosis practitioner. I use a forensic type of questioning, which is not really questioning at all. Under hypnosis, I do not lead the witness. I hypnotized Pam in 2019, and then I hypnotized Ashley in early 2020. They had not shared information because there had been a falling out between the 2 of them after this event occurred, and they had ended their teamwork together. Finally, they did come together and are continuing with their own investigation, and I am still working on the investigation of this case. When I have a good case, which is very, very rare, I spend a great deal of time working on it.
Now, Pam, tell us about your experience with this investigation.
Okay, so Ashley lives in Georgia. She drove to my home, and this would have been early Saturday morning on June 27th. We hopped in the car and drove about 3.5 hours east down to Chris's house, arriving early afternoon. And so we spent probably 2 to 3 hours getting to know him and his family, chatting about his experience that he had with his son. I think it was in 2007, and just hearing about all of the strangeness that occurs on the property. He had lots of stories to tell us that had been witnessed by very reliable sources. Many are well known in the field of ufology. And so we were very impressed with the amount of activity on the site. And so we felt like we had a really good understanding of how to approach the investigation that evening. We had planned to go out around sunset, but a huge thunderstorm pushed through, and that delayed our investigation until about 10 p.m. that evening. So we went out, set up our equipment. Ashley had her video camera on a tripod, so she got that set up and going. And then we went over under the tree to begin our investigation. And we each, Ashley and I each have an SB7, a spirit box that we use to communicate with. It sweeps radio frequencies at a very high rate of intensity. And we found that it to be a very good device for the kind of work that we do. We also each had a digital handheld recorder, our 35 millimeter cameras. And so we began by starting the video camera and then kind of walking around the property, taking photographs. And then we ended up back under the tree and began the EVP session. Initially, there were about 7 of us out in the yard. It was Ashley, myself, Chris, his wife, and 3 family members. And they stayed with us for about 45 minutes. So about 10:45, they went inside. We did the walk around, ended up under the tree around 11 that evening and began our investigation. So we approached it as we normally would, just asking, who's here, who would like to speak with us, where do you come from, what are your names? And immediately we began getting EVPs, acknowledging that there was ET presence and telling us to look to the left of the moon, and that's exactly where Chris had seen this bright light. And so we're discussing, is it a star? It's awfully bright to be a star. And at the same time, we're getting EVPs saying to the left of the moon. They're telling us we're here, we're to the left of the moon. I can't remember all the EVPs, but it was just great stuff. So we knew that we were on to something, and we ramped up our questioning. But the strange thing, we began at 10 o'clock, and the audio on the recorders runs until about 11:15, so about an hour and 15 minutes. And at the very end of that hour and 15 minutes, suddenly you hear Ashley saying, "So you want us to turn our equipment off?" And I say something like, "Should we turn our equipment off?" And Ashley's like, "Yeah, I think we should." And I said, "Yeah, I think we should too." It was like we were taking direction from some unknown person telling us to turn our equipment off. And as Kathleen reported, the next thing we remember, we're standing staring at the moon, and we're all swaying, dizzy, and nauseous, and just a little bit dazed and confused about, what was going on. And then we realized we weren't holding our equipment and turned around, and it was laying on the ground behind us. And again, as Kathleen said, we would never have laid our equipment on the wet ground, and it's counterintuitive. We were there to collect evidence, and those are our primary tools. Why would we have turned our equipment off? And so we were really just pretty dazed. We picked our equipment up. We didn't say much. Ashley got her video camera and the tripod, and we went in the house. When we entered the back door, Chris's wife came from the bedroom. She was pretty frantic about, where had we been? and because it was 1 o'clock in the morning. And so we really had not kept a close eye on the time, but I was surprised that it was 1 o'clock in the morning. I just, was rather taken aback by that. But we had driven 3.5 hours. We were tired, and we had a 3.5 hour drive back home, and we were going to do it that evening. And so we just kind of chalked it up to being tired, and started drinking coffee, getting ready for the ride back. So we returned back to my home, sleep a couple of hours. Ashley returned to Georgia, and I began reviewing the evidence, the audio evidence, and realized, pretty quickly into it that we were communicating with ET. There was no spirit about it. But there was also a lot of the sort of the angelic stuff that Chris has been experiencing coming through. And that was part of our line of questioning, knowing some of the encounters that he had had with the lady. So, we did target some of our questioning to that area, and we got some really good EVPs, great EVPs about them being to the left of the moon, and they see us, and then after an hour and 15 minutes, my audio ended. So I started thinking, okay, we went out at 10 o'clock. I have an hour and 15 minutes of recorded EVP. That would take us to 11:15, but we didn't go inside until 1 o'clock. And it occurred to me at that point, we were missing an hour and 45 minutes. So knowing Ashley was still on the road, I called her on her cell phone and I said, look, something really strange happened last night. I'm missing about an hour and 45 minutes of audio. And, how did this happen? That would have taken us to 11:15, but we didn't go in until 1. I said, as soon as you get home, start reviewing. And she did, and she had similar audio, but it was when she pulled the video that we both realized something pretty phenomenal had occurred that evening. We still couldn't put the pieces together. It seemed to cause a lot of anxiety in us over the subsequent weeks. We argued about, what could have taken place and what we remembered. And I think that's what led to us kind of dissolving our partnership. It became sort of more of a bone of contention than, being collaborative. And I think it was just the anxiety of the unknown, that, something had clearly happened that night, but we just couldn't put it all together. And neither of us had memories of what would have occurred during that missing time. She did go on to pull the audio, break the audio out from the video camera, and we began to have a clearer picture of what may have happened at that point. But again, we didn't really talk about it because we kind of dissolved our partnership. And I did stay in touch with Chris and went back down there a couple of other times just to see, what might happen. And, we did capture some really good things, but it didn't really enlighten me as to what might have occurred that night of June 27th. Then what followed was Chris reported to me that he had developed rheumatoid arthritis, just completely out of the blue. And he could hardly fasten his shirt or tie his shoes. And it was pretty bad. So I think that was just within a few months after the investigation. And then later in 2016, I also developed rheumatoid arthritis. And was diagnosed by a rheumatologist, and there's no family history for me. I'd never had any problems before, and I thought, this is really strange. You know, Chris suddenly gets rheumatoid arthritis, and now I've developed it. And I don't know, something inside me told me that perhaps there's a connection there. But at that point, I didn't know what it might be, but I was in a lot of pain. So I started seeing an acupuncturist, and he helped me a lot with the arthritis, but he did a lot of needlework on my third eye. He always, you know, inserted a needle into the third eye. And I think that kind of began to open up some memories for me, but it was just flashes, and I would awake each morning with a tremendous amount of anxiety, just wanting to remember the details. And so that's when I reached out to Kathleen, and you know, we communicated for some time about trying to piece things together. And then I went down and visited with her and had the regression, and the pieces really, you know, started to come together at that point about what had occurred that evening.
Now, I'd like to get both of your take on this. There's been, you know, cases over the years. Some of them have had, you know, crossing parallels with the paranormal and other aspects to it that kind of connect these two fields of paranormal and ufology. And this is one of those cases. I find them more rare than most. But, you know, what are some of the aspects do you think that set this case apart from most? We'll start with you, Pam.
You mean set the case apart from my personal?
From other UFO cases.
I think just the evidence, the actual evidence. I mean, we have so much audio, possibly 100 pieces of EVP, and then combine that with this incredible video where you see more than one entity at this tree, the tree of activity. So I think that's what sets it apart. You know, you hear people talk about encounters, and they might have a grainy photo of some orb, you know, up in the sky. And, you know, not to discount anyone's experience. I just think, you know, they didn't have the right tools on hand, or didn't know what kind of equipment to use, or weren't expecting anything to happen to even have equipment on hand. I think, you know, that also makes what happened to Ashley and I different. We went there, you know, looking for evidence and had the equipment in hand. And so we were fortunate enough that the area that we were investigating is so active that immediately we began communicating with ET, and then had the experience.
What about you, Kathleen? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as Pam said, the level of evidence in this case is extraordinary. That is why I wanted to investigate it at length, as I am now doing. It's fairly rare when a case reaches that level of evidence. And we have 3 witnesses that who all are reporting this identical information. And although their experiences on the craft, well, we have Pam and Ashley's, we know what happened now. I have offered to hypnotize Chris, but I have interviewed Chris. I ended up interviewing Pam for 8 hours before the hypnosis session that we did, also with Ashley separately. So there's just a tremendous amount of evidence, and it sets it apart because it's not your typical abduction where people are taken onto the craft, placed on tables, and given a physical examination. This was different. Do you want to know how it was different?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, sure. Of course.
Okay. Well, Pam and Ashley were taken by different types of entities. Pam's entities were human types, and they were about 6 feet tall, very beautiful looking humans. The men had, chiseled noses, beautiful faces, kind of shoulder length. I think it was kind of light brown, ash blonde hair. The women did too. There were individual differences between them, but they could have all been related. Men were dressed in blue, tight-fitting uniforms. Pam kept seeing the color of robin blue or bluebird blue, just a beautiful blue.
Now, is this information what came out from the hypnosis session?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Tell us, some more of the details that came out of that session.
And well, Pam was absorbed into a beam of light, and then found herself on the craft where she was frightened. And they put some type of a thick felt-like vest on her, and she became very calm when she had that vest placed on her. They kind of took her on a tour of the craft, and Pam can describe it in much better detail than I can, because that's always true of the person who lived it. But they took her to what was almost like a plasma water wall with beautiful shades of blue and white. And then it kind of revved up, and there were green colors. And she was made to understand that there were many numbers inside this, and that this kind of controlled the craft. And she was so interested in this. It was so beautiful that she wanted to touch it. And they kept advising her that she shouldn't get too near to it because it could harm her. And I'm wondering if that is what caused the autoimmune system disorder that caused Chris and Pam to develop rheumatoid arthritis.
Very interesting.
Because it was, it was just so beautiful. She just couldn't really help herself. She was so absorbed in all of this. And then they took her to another part of the craft where she discovered that they had sort of memory kind of windows, or windows that could open at will, but you could not see them when you looked at the wall. When she wanted to see out, they opened them for her. And they had gone to a new place where they landed, where, it could have been the moon. It was a barren place. There was no vegetation. She was taken from the craft, and Ashley was as well. Ashley was with another type of entity, and she was placed into a pod for this trip. Pam didn't remember being placed in a pod. But that's not a big deal. Ashley remembered Pam being placed in the pod, but that is not something that Pam had mentioned. They were both taken into buildings that they described individually under hypnosis, but they described the same building. And they talked about Pam talked about, let me talk about Pam. She was advised, she was given information about these individuals and how at one time they lived on this planet hundreds of thousands of years ago. And when the planet could no longer sustain the people who were here, they had moved on. And they came back from time to time to check on our development. And they said that they had known Pam through all lifetimes. and that they can hop through time and space. So they gave some very interesting information. Those are the things that really stand out in my mind, but I'm sure that Pam can give you and the listeners a lot more detail about her experience.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask, Pam, if you could fill in any other details that you feel are important. And before your regression, what did you remember, if anything?
Before the regression, I started having just like flashes of memory of like the blue light, this beautiful blue light sort of surrounding me. So I would flash on that, and I had memories of like seeing these beings and the plasma wall or water wall, but none of the details were really coming through for me. It's almost like you have like a little bit of a movie that kind of plays in front of your field of vision. It's not like your imagination. It's just like a little movie clip that would just clip through, and I would see things, but I could not put a full comprehensive picture together of, you know, what actually happened until I met with Kathleen. And, you know, then it became all very clear and is very familiar. So what I recall is being like absorbed onto the craft and seeing this plasma wall and knowing that it had something to do with the propulsion of the ship. That's the information that they were giving me, and all of this was telepathic. You know, there weren't any mouths moving or words being spoken. It was just coming through. But that was a very important part of being on board the craft, was them sharing this plasma wall and the way they hop. Because I asked them about the windows. I said, you don't have any windows. How do you know where you are? And they told me, we don't need to know where we are. We hop. We hop across time and space. And so that's when the wall kind of revved up, and white came in, and then green kind of came in towards the bottom. And when that subsided, these smart windows appeared, and I could see that we were no longer on planet Earth, but had like descended and landed on this very barren looking planet with this geodesic dome is the best way I can describe it, sitting off in the distance, the building that we ended up in. But some of the other things on board that I remember, like looking at this smart pad. It was like a handheld glass pad, you know, I guess similar to what we have, but it was glass. And they could scroll through it and show me images in this glass pad of like city, almost scenes from a city street. And they were talking about how the planet is going through a vibrational change, that part of their mission here is to probe our sun and our solar system to measure the patterns in these energy waves, that the sun's energy waves are expanding, and that the expansion is pushing all the planets in our solar system, as well as some nearby star clusters, into a higher vibrational frequency. And so he said that as the planets in our solar system and the waves become larger, we're pushed out, and that pushes us into an area of energy that maintains a higher frequency of vibration, and that when the energy within these areas rise, then matter changes. And that, so he showed me these images of humans on Earth, and some had waves of energy vibrations like coming through their bodies, and some had no vibrations. And that he basically said that to survive these upcoming planetary and solar system changes, that we have to raise our vibrational frequency, and because that's going to eventually change all matter. And this has come to me in bits and pieces. Some came through the regression with Kathleen, and some came through in a session that I had when I participated in a research study. So that, you know, that piece of information is kind of astounding. I'm really not sure what to think about it, but it kind of goes along with intuitively knowing that, you know, we can change our vibration, we can change our energy and our consciousness with the right intention. And I feel that there are more and more people on the planet trying to do that. You know, it's such a crazy time, and we need to raise our consciousness. And perhaps, you know, some of the things that we're going through is a wake-up call to us all to pay more attention to you know, what potentially could be happening to us as a human race or species.
Now, understand they also gave you information about their technology or possible future technologies?
Well, they gave me some information about how they build their crafts. He communicated that there is a mothership somewhere, and that they actually build their crafts using pure energy at like a microatomic level, and that they convert it into a physical substance. And I mean, it's hard for me to even talk about because I don't fully understand it. I'm not, you know, a nuclear physicist or a quantum theorist. I have some research background, but nothing at that scientific level. But it said that he said that the microatomic energy that enfolds the craft makes it capable of utilizing different speeds and the wavelength of light. And the craft can move from one point to another in an instant because there's no velocity, only a shift in frequency as it aligns itself with the wave energy of light. So that creates a shift in space and time, and that's the key to space travel.
Now, Kathleen, what overall, if any, conclusions have you come to about this case, and you know its effects or impacts on ufology in the field in general?
We have not publicized this case yet. This show is the first time that we are speaking about this. And I think that it is such an extraordinary case that we do need to take it forward. I know there is scientific interest in this case. Pam has stated that. And I'm sure that there's a lot of interest in the physics behind their travel and the information that they gave to Pam. So that's extremely important. But for the nuts and bolts kind of field investigator or ufologist, there is nuts and bolts evidence. For the people who are interested in communication with non-human intelligence, you have that communication, and you have very important and interesting information being relayed. You have information from Ashley on how they travel through space, how they put you in a pod, and that there is some kind of energy field in that pod that protects the human body, because it is so difficult for the human body to travel in space. And just there's a tremendous amount of information and evidence. And when really Pam and Ashley decide to release the photographic evidence, what you're going to see is that beam of light that Pam described. And on that beam of light, you see what appears to be entities who are not entirely solid. And they drop off that beam. And then they become more solid. They become denser as they move toward the ground. And they may even start out being very small and expand in size as they move toward the ground too. I'm fascinated by the frame-by-frame analysis that the footage that they've permitted me to look at and analyze, and it is extraordinary because you actually see these entities.
Now, Pam, any final thoughts on this case before we move on from this, or any conclusions you've come to?
Just one thing that we haven't talked about. In the first 8 minutes of the video that began at 10 o'clock, that's when what Kathleen just described, that's when that was captured. The entities were captured during that time. But what is really interesting as well is the audio. You can hear Ashley, myself, Chris, and his wife talk about, getting this camera set up. And Ashley went back to the house to get a new battery because suddenly the battery had become drained. She just charged all the batteries. She put the battery in. Suddenly it's drained. So she gets a new battery, gets the camera going, and we're talking about going towards the tree to begin our investigation with the spirit box. And you can hear us move away from the microphone. Our voices, become not as loud. You can tell that we've walked, a distance away. But then at the same time, you can hear Ashley and I talking right beside the video camera. And we're talking about being returned. And I'm saying, look, the craft, are those the same people looking out the window? And well, actually, right before that, you hear a robotic voice say, "Step out." And it's not human. It's like a mechanized voice saying, "Step out." And then I'm saying, are those the same people looking out the window? And Ashley's not happy about being back. I can't repeat what she said, but she was not happy about being back. And so how can we be in two places at one time? Where clearly we had walked with Chris and his wife over to begin the investigation under the tree, but yet Ashley and I are at the camera talking about being brought back. So there was also some type of time warp that occurred that night, because after 11:15, when we were gone, Ashley's video camera was still recording. And well, let me back up a little. It would have been right before they took us. Her camera is still recording. And after they took us, it's still recording. And you no longer hear myself, Ashley, or Chris talking, but you hear voices about, we're abducting, we've got them, I'm on them. They make some reference to coming in too hot, break, back up. Okay, now we're on them. So we have like a lot of audio clearly when the craft is coming in and they're talking about taking us. So I can't begin to figure out how that time warp happened, because they took us at the end of the audio, but if you listen to the first 8 minutes, they've already brought us back. So that, we're still trying to work through that with Kathleen, trying to get a handle on this time warp. So if any final thoughts, we do not have this thing figured out. I mean, we have some of it, kind of in our grasp, but there are still a lot of unknowns.
Now, for me, I think if more researchers from different fields of, say, ufology and paranormal would come together and, put these fields together more, I think that we'd get a little further, because I think they're very much connected in profound ways. Now, I want to ask both of you this. We'll start with you, Pam. Is this something also that you found along your years of research, that paranormal and the metaphysical and ufology are connected in very deep ways that we don't understand yet?
Absolutely. And I think that has to do with the multiverse that surrounds us, that some of the information that Ashley and I have gathered over the years truly is historical timelines, that we're interacting with these beings that are in an adjacent timeline in another historical setting, because the evidence is there. They're telling us who they are, how they lived their lives, the foods they ate, the games the children played. But then we'll have these portal and, clearly ET and UFO referenced EVPs coming through. And some of the dark side, we've encountered some very negative energy through our work, possession. Ashley was attacked in the old city jail in Charleston, attacked viciously, and we have supporting audio of that attack, and we actually presented that on TV on A&E. But so yes, it definitely overlaps. I think a lot of it is your intention. What is your intention when you go out to investigate? Do you want to just be scared? Okay, there are things out there that will scare you and that can harm you. Or do you want to learn from these historic timelines? Well, yeah, that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to learn, but at the same time, we realized there's something else occurring here. There's another intelligence that wants to come through and communicate with us, and that's the ET. So, there's a multiple grouping of beings out there that are very willing to communicate, and it all goes hand in hand.
What are your thoughts on those connections, Kathleen?
I think it's extremely important to have an interdisciplinary team. I work with Paul Eno, who is a prominent paranormal investigator, has his own radio show out of Rhode Island, and we have learned from one another over the years. I have a great deal of respect for him. Also with Denise Stoner, who is a paranormal specialist. In the 3 studies that I have worked on, we have discovered that there is an overlap of the paranormal in 60% of experiencer cases. There are the observation of what appear to be light orbs with intelligence in the home of the experiencer. This is not what I'm not talking about kicking up dust and taking a photograph. I'm talking about light orbs that are visible with the human eye. I have a very important case that I have been investigating since, I think it was 2013. The individual developed lymphoma. I told him to ask for healing telepathically over and over again, and to pray if he was a religious person, which he was. A couple of weeks later, a light orb slid down his bedroom wall. It's captured on video. It was beautiful white interior with a lovely blue halo. It flew across the room. It put down tendrils. They were iridescent. It dove into his body. He slept for 12 hours, and when he awakened, he no longer had the enlarged nodes on his neck. When he went in for surgery, they discovered that the nodes were not cancerous at that point. There were 4 tiny necrotic nodes removed. This was investigated by Dr. Joseph Burks as well, medical doctor who has all of his medical records and has written about his experience in Free's book, Beyond UFOs. So we have that. We have the overlap of orbs, and we also, about 60% report the feeling that something unseen is walking on their mattress when they're in bed. And it doesn't matter if it's night or daytime. It's happened both of those times. The poltergeist activity is at a lower percentage, but it still occurs, doors opening and closing. In one case that I'm aware of, the individual was watching television, decided to turn it off. It continued to run, even though she turned it off. She unplugged it from the wall, and it continued to run. That sort of thing occurs in the homes of experiencers at a statistically significant level.
Now, whenever we're talking about this activity, connecting the paranormal, and do you think that more researchers in the future are going to realize that this is all connected? I see it happening now. More people are coming, but we have the nuts and bolts researchers that the older school that kind of refuse to go to the metaphysical side of it, and also when it comes to these nuts and bolts researchers, there are some that the ones that refuse to see the metaphysical side, that just think these beings are coming from different planets far off in the universe. Now, I'm not so sure that's always the case. It's possible that it could be some of the time. But also, what are your thoughts on that, if these beings are coming from different planets, or that they could possibly be around us at all time, just beyond the our visible spectrum? I know that's a lot to unpack, but
I had difficulty with that for years. I was a nuts and bolts investigator for probably the first 20 years of my investigations for the Mutual UFO Network. But in 2011, I had to expand my level of acceptance, because it hit me in the face that if I simply looked the other way, I was not being scientifically honest. And it was so prevalent in the cases that I was investigating that I could no longer ignore it and live with myself. Others can ignore it. They don't want to know about it. Maybe it's too troubling to them. Some people put a religious or negative connotation to it, but it's there. It's all part of the same consciousness. And all of these things are occurring. And that's why I now realize, for the past 11 years, have been expanding more and more into a multidisciplinary explanation, working with individuals from different fields. from the paranormal fields, UFO nuts and bolts, UFO consciousness kind of activity. It runs the gamut. Psychologists are also very important in this. Sociologists, that's my background, is in sociology and psychology. And all of these have to come together if we are ever to understand these phenomena.
Now, to end on, there are folks like Pam and yourself that have more experiences than others that can actually see through the spectrum a little bit easier. And we are also experiencing a time where I see that more people are kind of starting to open up to this. That more people may not be experiencing this, but becoming more open and aware of these things are occurring, and that there possibly may be something to this. Do you think that we're entering a time where it's possible where everyone will be more open to this, and just it'll be common knowledge that this is a part of our existence, and people welcome this as part of our reality? Do you see that in our lifetime? We'll start with you, Pam.
Unfortunately, I don't think I'll see it in my lifetime, not where it encompasses the entire population of the globe. I think I will see it ramp up, and I'm seeing that. It's hard to step back and just see it from a regular person's perspective, because this has been a part of my life since I was a child, so it feels very normal. It's been difficult for me to comprehend that not everyone thinks the way I do, but I am seeing more and more people start to kind of wake up to other possibilities of existence, that reality is not exactly what we think it is. More people are talking about it. I find that, I used to not be quite as open to talk about the subject with people, but I have people now approaching me, asking questions, and so I think I'm seeing a ramping up of, if nothing else, curiosity, but hopefully a real desire to learn and to try to figure out what is happening around us. What is our true life as a conscious being? What would that entail? I think the possibilities could be so wonderful if we were all more conscious about how we treat each other, how we treat the planet, and that would reverberate out into our galaxy and into the universe. And perhaps that is happening more, and maybe that consciousness is what's drawing the ETs to us, that we have to kind of be on their level of understanding. And maybe that's why they're really starting to pay more attention, perhaps.
What are your final thoughts on that, Kathleen?
Well, I do know that there are many theoretical physicists and social scientists who are very interested in this, that they are collaborating together. They have been since the Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation began. I'm part of that as well. We did a study on 3,200 experiencers and really delved into some of the deeper questions involving consciousness, involving the nature of what is occurring, out-of-body experiences, people who are able to communicate telepathically with what we call NHI, non-human intelligence. And Free thinks that it is all part of the same spectrum, which I find very interesting. I haven't gotten to that point yet, I'm not certain, But remember only 9 years ago, I left the nuts and bolts, not entirely because I still do the nuts and bolts part of the investigation, but began to look at the broader spectrum of what is occurring. I'm hopeful for the future. I know that this is becoming an interest to very well-educated individuals who are attempting to determine what is actually happening. These extraterrestrials told Pam that we are part of the same creator. They tell people that they communicate that we all share one consciousness. And so part of the answer lies in that, I believe. Consciousness studies are taking place now that are very exciting. So I think that if we just all put our heads together, that we're going to have a new understanding. I don't know if that will happen in my lifetime, but I'm very hopeful that this research will continue and we will have more answers in the future.
Very well said. And Pam, Kathleen, thank you both so much for coming on tonight. That was excellent information. And before you each head out, if people are interested in finding out more about your work, any of your books, anything like that, let them know where they can do so. Start with you, Kathleen.
Okay, you can go to Kathleen with a K Marden, MARDEN.com, to my website, and all 5 of my books are for sale there. They're professionally published. I work for a publishing company, and they publish my books, and they're available on the website, autographed, or you can get them in multiple formats at Barnes & Noble and Amazon and other fine bookstores. There are also articles that you can read if you're interested in the social psychological research that I have done into this phenomenon.
All right. And what about you, Pam?
I do not have a website. Ashley and I did have a website when we had our partnership, but that was dissolved. But you can Google Pamela Nance, paranormal investigator, if you want to read articles or look at some of the videos that Ashley and I did while we were in partnership. There's some a YouTube channel, Spirit Hunters of the South, that you can tune into to listen to some of the EVP evidence and read about some of our case studies.
All right. Very good. Well, that was excellent information. And I'd love to have you both on if you get any more conclusions to your investigations there.
Yeah, thank you.
Certainly.
Definitely. All right. Well, you both have a great rest of your evening, and we will talk again later. And for everyone else, we will see you next time on Forbidden Knowledge News. Good night, everyone.